laws might censor legitimate literary or even feminist material because state censorship has a history of being used against those who are disempowered or those who challenge the status quo. Andrea Dworkin argues that liberal argument of defending free speech do not apply to pornography. Mill argues that free speech must be protected because the free exchange of ideas is necessary for progress and truth. But according to Dworkin, pornography does not express ideas and so it is not relevant to truth or progress. As Dworkin puts in 1997, we are told all the times that pornography is really about ideas. Well, a rectum does not have an idea and a vagina doesn't have an idea, and the mouths of women in pornography do not express ideas. Key thinkers: Andrea Dworkin, born in 1946, died in 2005. In all her work, Dworkin argues that male violence against women is both the most shocking and the most common aspect of patriarchy. She documents and analyzes many varieties of male violence, including rape, domestic violence, the abuse of women in pornography, and racial violence, and argues that women can never be free until men's violence against them is stopped. Dworkin sees male violence as intricately related to patriarchal sexuality, according to which heterosexuality only is female submission and male domination. One of her books, Intercourse in 1987, explores heterosexuality as it is constructed under conditions of patriarchy. Another, Pornography, Men Possessing Women, 1981, discussed the role that pornography plays in perpetuating sexual hierarchy and violence. Catherine McKinnon, 1987, has further argument against the idea that free speech protects pornography. For McKinnon, it is pornography itself that constrains speech. Specifically, it silences women by emphasizing that they are inferior to men and the women are properly thought of sexual object for male consumption. If women themselves are to be able to speak freely, McKinnon argues that they need to be equality and the equality is incompatible with pornography. Pornography and sex. A central part of Dworkin and McKinnon's argument against pornography is that pornography depicts sexual hierarchy. Indeed, their anti-pornography civil rights ordinance defines pornography as sexual material depicting women as inferior or violated. For Dworkin and McKinnon, the sexualization of hierarchy is part of what makes pornography so anti-helical of feminism. They argue that much of the pornography depicts women as enjoying abuse of humiliation and that it reflects and perpetuates the real abuse that women experiences every day. The fact that pornography is supposed to be sexually arousing demonstrates the deep nature of inequality. The abuse and inferiority of women is portrayed as erotic and exciting. Thus, McKinnon argues that pornography makes hierarchy sexy and calls it the truth about sex or just a mirror of reality. Through this process, pornography constructs what a woman is and what women wants from sex, what men want from sex. This is what pornography means, 1987. The Dworkin-McKinnon Civil Rights Ordinance. In 1980s, Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon drafted a civil rights ordinance. As civil rights legislation, the ordinance would not censor pornography or prevent it from being published. Instead, it would allow people, particularly not only women, who had been harmed by pornography to sue its makers for damages. The ordinance thus intended to allow action by those coerced into appearing in the pornography, those on whom pornography is forced, for example, in the workplace or at home, and those who are raped by men acting on the influence of pornography or copying scenes from violent pornography. In the case of women coerced into pornography, for example, prevailing the US laws does forbid the coercion but protects as free speech of pornography depicting the rape. The ordinance was passed into Indianapolis in 1984. In 1985, it was struck down by the Seventh Circuit Court for violating the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which prohibits laws that abridge from freedom of speech. In 1986, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, leaving the Seventh Circuit Court judgment in place. The ordinance defined pornography as the graphic, sexually explicit subordination of women through pictures or words that also includes women dehumanized as sexual objects, things, or commodities, enjoying the pain or humiliation of rape, being tied up, cut up, mutilated, bruised, or physically hurt, in postures of sexual submission or servility or display, reduced to body parts penetrated by objects or animals, or presented in scenarios of degradation, injury, torture, shown as filthy or inferior, bleeding, bruised, or hurt in a context that makes these conditions sexual. These objections to the way in which sex is depicted in pornography have led other anti censorship feminists to depict writers such as Dworkin and McKinnon as prudish. A sister describes them as anti sex, and Strauchan in 2000 accuses them of causing a pornophobic sex panic. According to a sister and Strauchan, feminists who object to pornography has no basis for their argument other than a dislike of sexual explicitness. Anti censorship feminists have therefore argued that pornography or sexually explicit material is a healthy expression of adult sexuality. For these feminists, it is misleading to describe pornography as necessarily subordinating women. It is quite possible to see pornography as an expression of mutually enjoyable sex. This disagreement is partly empirical, partly a matter of term, and partly normative. It is empirical that it reflects a disagreement about what proportion of pornography depicts acts that all feminists would agree are regarding degrading to women, or at least acts that depict violence against women. It is partly a matter of terminology in that Dworkin and McKinnon define pornography as material that is hierarchical. If Strauss and his sister are right that some pornography is not hierarchical, that Dworkin and McKinnon would simply say that it should not be called pornography, bracket, that perhaps it should be called erotica, bracket close. But there remains a normative aspect to disagreement. There is a disagreement between feminists as to whether certain images do in fact portray women as inferior or not. Pornography and violence. The connection between pornography and violence is perhaps the most controversial aspect of the debate. There are several parts to this issue. Point 1. Pornographic depiction of violence. Part 2. Violence and harm caused to women who appear in pornography. Part 3. Pornography encouraging its audience to commit acts of violence. Pornography depiction of violence. Much feminist debate concerns the question of violence depicted in pornography. In part, this because pornography that is explicitly violent seems difficult for anti censorship feminists to defend. Many such feminists thus argue that while some pornography is violent, most pornography is not, and that consequently approaches such as the Dworkin and McKinnon are misleading, and the example of violent pornography that they use are unrepresentative. Key thinkers. Catherine A. McKinnon, born in 1946. Catherine McKinnon is the Elizabeth A. Long Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. She has written many books covering a wide range of feminist issues such as sexual harassment, pornography, rape, and domestic violence, law, the state, and international human rights. McKinnon is a radical feminist arguing that male violence and the eroticization of inequality are central to patriarchy. McKinnon is a practicing lawyer as well as an academic. Her work pioneered the legal treatment of sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination in the United States of America. It is certainly true that many anti-pornographic feminists do analyze explicitly violent pornography. It is also certainly true that such material exists. Quite how prevalent it is, however, is unclear. Although there have been some studies, a study in 1980s of material freely available as opposed to sold under the counter in sex shops in 4 US cities analyzed the cover images but not the inside pictures of 5,000 randomly selected books, magazines, and films. It is found that a quarter of them depicted violence, which many of those depicting violence inside rather than on the cover. It is also worth noting that a new law proposed by the UK government in 2006 would make the possession bracket as opposed to merely the distribution bracket closed of severely violent pornography illegal to defense of the legislation. The Home Office notes that the internet makes severely violent material much more commonly available. Harm to women appearing in pornography. Dworkin and McKinnon argue that pornography causes real harm to the real women who appear in it. Wherever pornography depicts a woman in a position of humiliation or bondage, a real woman has led to experience humiliation in bondage. Moreover, they point out that some women are coerced into appearing in pornography. One important example of a woman coerced into appearing in pornography is the woman known as Linda Lovelace, who appears in the best-selling pornographic film Deep Throat. Lovelace has described how she was trapped and brutally coerced into appearing in that other films. The suffering, rape, and torture from the man who incarcerated her and made the films. Against these examples, some feminists point out the rape and violence are already illegal. Cases such as that of Linda Lovelace do not justify censorship of pornography because it is the violence rather than the pornography that is the problem. While this is true, it is worth noting that laws against rapes are not as same as laws against pornography showing a rape in the United States. The rape throat is protected as freedom of speech regardless of the circumstances in which it was filmed. Dworkin and McKinnon thus argue that it is necessary to change the law such as pornography depicting real life rape is not legally protected. Pornography as incitement to violence. The question of whether pornography incites women who view it as a commits act of sexual violence against women and children is hotly debated. Two kinds of evidence are offered. The first is anecdotal. Examples of attacks in which pornography was used, or for women or children who were forced to copy pornographic images, or of rapists who had large collection of pornography. For example, in the hearings of the Dworkin-McKinnon Ordinance, one Native American woman described how two white men raped her. During the attack, they repeatedly referred to a computer game called Custer's Revenge, in which the aim of the game is to rape Native American women. The second sort of evidence offered to support that claim the pornography incites its audience to violence is that provided by experimental studies, of which there are many. Another example described at the ordinance hearing exposed US volunteer male college student to one film per day for 5 days. Some law slasher films bracket combining sex with explicitly gory violence bracket closed. Some saw non-violent pornography and control group watched a law school documentary. The study found that the men viewing that violence material became increasingly desensitized to the violence. The significance of these sorts of evidence is contested. One problem is that different experiments have conflicting results. Another problem is that anecdotal violence evidence is available only for correlation between pornography and violence. It does not prove that the pornography caused the violence. Many men view pornography and do not become violent. There is therefore no consciousness about whether pornography causes violence, and if it does so, what is the implications of that would be. Opponents of censorship argue that even if some violence is caused by pornography, the correct response is to tackle violence rather than pornography. Opponents of pornography argue that violence against women is not, in fact, prosecuted within any regularity, and the part of problem is that pornography helps to make violence against women. Question number 1. What is feminism? Question mark. Question number 2. What does it mean to say that personal is political? Question mark. Question number 3. What is the family relevant to feminism? Question mark. Question number 4. Is there a difference between sex and gender? Is the difference important? Question mark. Question number 5. What is the difference between feminism based on sameness and feminism based on difference? Question mark. Question number 6. Is the ethics of care a good alternative to justice? Question mark. Question number 7. What is the significance of violence against women? Question mark. Question number 8. How can feminists be both for and against pornography? Question mark. Question number 9. What is the difference between liberal feminism and radical feminism? Question mark. Question number 10. What changes do feminists think are needed in order to bring about gender equality? Question mark. Further reading. Bryson v. 1999. Feminist Debates. Issues of Theory and Political Practice. Basingstoke Paul gave a useful introductory text on feminism. Hooks B. 1982. Ain't a Woman, Black Woman and Feminism. London. Pluto Press argues that feminism often ignores the situation of black women and underestimates the significance of difference between women. Aitchison C. 1992. Pornography. Oxford University Press. This collection contains many articles discussing pornography from a feminist standpoint. Mill J. S. 1869. The Subjection of Woman. Many editions are available. Argues that women and men should have equal rights in law and that differences between them are the result of nurture rather than of nature. Wollstonecraft M. 1792. A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Many editions available. A classic early statement
Book
of women's
Handbook of Political Theory. Authors Kukathas and Goss. Chapter Postmodern Approach to Political Theory. This is Chapter 4 by Jane Bennett. The term postmodernism has currency in political theory. but also in literary studies, philosophy, anthropology, the arts, and popular discourse, in each case functioning somewhat differently. Its usages can be summarized under three headings. One, as a sociological designation for an epochal shift in the way collective life is organized, in brackets from centralized and hierarchical control towards a network structure. Two, as an aesthetic genre, brackets, literature that experiments with non-linear narration, a playful architecture of mixed styles, and appreciation of popular culture that complicates the distinction between high and low. 3. As a set of philosophical critiques of teleological and or rationalist conceptions of nature, history, power, freedom, and subjectively. Postmodernism in political theory participates in all three, but perhaps most intensively in the third, which is the emphasis of this chapter. Judith Butler points out that to use the category postmodern theory is to make an assumption that postmodern theorists find problematic. That is, that theories offer themselves in bundles or in organized totalities, and that a set of theories which are structurally similar emerge as the articulation of an historically specific condition of human reflection. In all areas, discussions of postmodernism are highly charged. It is routinely denounced as nihilistic, immoral, and politically irresponsible. Indeed, the term is invoked more often by those who oppose postmodernism than by those said to be its practitioners. Many of the latter reject it as a self description. Giles Deleuze, because he pursued a kind of metaphysics, whereas uh, modernism is said to be post metaphysical, and because he referred he preferred a Kafkaesque sense of humor and nonsense to the irony more typically associated with postmodernism. William Connolly, because the term is identified with the theme of the word as a text, a theme he takes to underestimate the significance of human corporeality, and because the term's content floats with the concerns of the critic bestowing the name. Crucilla Cornell accepts the designation reluctantly, in part because she rejects the very idea that periods of history can be rigidly separated. Richard Rorty feels doomed to be referred to as a postmodernist, but acknowledges that the people they are bunching me with do share quite a few enemies and attitudes. Amidst all this, I will retain the label because it gestures, however imperfectly, towards an innovative body of theoretical work that came of age in the last several decades. Within political theory, critics from both the right and the left have tended to see postmodernism as a rejection of the quest for an objective truth behind the subjective experiences. Because this quest is a thought to set the condition of possibility for any affirmative claim, postmodern political theory is charged with being anti political and unable to take an ethical stand, except that of resistance, disobedience, refusal, or deconstruction for deconstruction's sake. Stephen White offers a subtle version of this criticism. While post structuralist and postmodern thought carries a persistent utopian hope of a not yet, it is too often remains blithely unspecific about normative orientation in here and now. In response, some postmodernists contend that a positive ethic need not require a universal God. Page 47. Reason or some such surrogate can be the grounded on the cultivation of existential attachment to life rather than on internal or external authority. The complex of epistemological and ontological claims that constitute the distinctive style of thinking called postmodern cannot with justice be reduced to negativism. Nevertheless, the charge has prompted some of its best theorists to articulate more closely the affirmative possibilities within their approach. I will focus in what follows on the positive themes within postmodernism. The summary is a selective account of what a postmodernist sensibility has to offer in the way of an affirmative political vision. Postmodernism in political theory emerged and continues to develop in close relation to other theoretical approaches, including feminism, liberalism, psychoanalytic theory, critical theory, and utopianism. It makes the most sense, then, when understood in dialogue with these other perspectives as part of a broader discussion about the nature of reality. the degree to which it is knowable or in some way accessible to experience, and the possibilities for its improvement in terms of justice, freedom, or humaneness. Postmodern theory often takes the form of genealogical studies, which reveal how discursive practices and conceptual schemata are embedded with power relations, and how these cultural forms constitute what is experienced as natural or real. One of the political insights of postmodern theory is that the stakes of a democratic politics are as much about modern crisis of representation as they are about the distribution of other goods. Dumb, Doom, 1999:60. Deconstructions of madness and criminality, feminist and queer studies of gender and sexuality, post-colonial studies of race and nation, these all seek to uncover the human madness of entities formerly considered either natural, universal, or inevitable. Much genealogical work, however, also insists upon the material recalcitrance of cultural products. Gender, sexuality, race, and personal identity are viewed as congealed responses to contingent sets of historical circumstances. And yet, the mere fact that they are human artifacts does not mean that they yield readily to human understanding or control. Gatens, 1996. A personal identity, for example, is a construction, but once sedimented into bodily movements, intense instinctive tendencies, linguistic routines, and institutional forms that resist human attempts to redirect or revise them. Everything is ac- ac- acculturated, but cultural reforms are themselves material assemblages of natural bodies. Postmodern theory acknowledges the artifice of the natural and the materiality of the cultural. In what follows, I emphasize how its partisans wrestle with this uneasy pair of insights: the elusive and productive excesses. There always exists, in words, things, bodies, thoughts, artifacts, ways of life, that which is persistently resistant to theoretical capture, or, for that matter, to any fixed form. This indeterminate and never fully determinable dimension of things has been described as difference or difference by Jacques Derrida, the virtual, Giles Deleuze, non-identity, Theodore Adorno, the invisible, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the immanent, William Colony, the semiotic, Julia Kristeva, sexual difference, Luce Irigaray, the real, Jacques Lacan, life, Frederick Nietzsche, or negativity, Diana Cool. Jean-Francois Lyotard calls it that which exceeds every putting into form or object without being anywhere else but within them. 1997:29. Whether this restlessness that haunts all positive forms is an ontological necessity or that effect of language is a question answered differently by various postmodern thinkers. Cool, 2000. In all cases, however, it functions as a chastening limit to the projects of political mastery, final moral codes, or normative consensus, reminding us of the capacity for resistance, perhaps even a moment of independence of life and the world. Postmodern political theory tries to acknowledge this resistance and to resist the urge to expel this disruptive force from politics. Brackets Honing, 1993. Difference is important to postmodern theory not only because it is, in some sense, and thus ought to be acknowledged, but also because its operation is seen as a condition of positivity or concrete form, such as such. Brackets Corson, 2001. In other words, difference both subsists in the positive and helps to produce new positivities. It is the the principle of generativity itself, that force of movement which genders meaning and institutions possible yet menaced. Apostrophe close, brackets cool, 2000 colon 74. Difference, the virtual non-identity etc. name, and on one hand, the remainder left out of any theoretical account, and on the other hand, the creative energy within existing forms out of which new things brackets identities comma rights comma social movements bracket close emerge. See further chapter 20. That creative process is understood as ever ongoing. Any given being is seen if dash if one places it in appropriate period of duration, as in the process of becoming, that is, becoming otherwise than it is. A contribution of Lacanian theory to postmodern political theory consists in its identification of these moments of becoming as political movements. In contrast to politics or the established institutional means for organizing collective life, the political here refers to those interruptive events that reveal politics. Page 48, to be a masking of the restless and stubbornly diverse quality of the real, or that which always exceeds actuality and eludes symbolic expression. The event of the political provides a glimpse into this real, thus revealing the phantasmic character of the image of society as a harmonious whole. Brackets Stavrakakis, 1999. The Lacanian notion of the political functions in a similar way to that Giles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, 1987, call, using a more physicalist vocabulary, the cosmic. The cosmic is that dimension of an entity, an act, or a claim that is energetic and not organized into an object of knowledge or thing with which it is possible to identify. The cosmic consists in unruly and unpredictable forces, densities, and intensities that are not thinkable in themselves. 1987 342 to 3. The cosmic is the virtual world that subsists in the actual and whose presence is signaled by the surprising eruption of an event that no one foresaw or could have foreseen. The cosmic in this political dimension of existence. The cosmic is this political dimension of existence. Why might postmodern political theorists invoke this turbulent and elusive realm? First, in order to assert the futility of attempts to achieve a final and fixed form of political order, a project which appears as something like an ontological impossibility. And second, in order to defend democratic culture with its constitutive tensions between order and disorder, as a form of governance that is, paradoxically most in harmony with the nature of being. The postmodern story of the world as itself political or having a cosmic dimension is one kind of a meta narrative. A meta narrative of immanence. A meta narrative is an overarching theory about the way the world operates, a story about the fundamental character of the natural social universe. As such, it functions as a frame of reference for judging other theories or more limited scope and aspiration. It may be experienced as a religious truth or as a metaphysical imaginary with a contingent heuristic value, or as occupying one of the many positions between these two poles. Meta-narratives are used within political theory to help legitimate a theory's claims about authority, the state, citizenship, freedom, rights, etc. For example, Hobbes uses a meta-narrative of a world of natural bodies in perpetual motion and a distant Jovian God to ground his notions of sovereignty, contract, political speech, and civil peace. One distinctive mark of postmodern theory is its rejection of those meta narratives that present themselves as expressive of a transcendental truth, or that view nature or history as having an intrinsic purpose, or that entail a two world metaphysic. Examples of the last include Plato's division between the true world of the forms and the deceptive world of sensuous appearances. Augustine's City of God and City of Man, Kant's noumenal and phenomenal realms, and Hegel's implicit idea as it unfolds in history. Some postmodern theorists reject any use of meta-narrative, but others do not. The second group affirms the psychological utility and ethical power of an ontological imaginary. These theorists, like Hobbes, link their political claims to speculative claims about nature, matter, or being. But their metaphysical views are presented as an onto story, whose persuasiveness is always at issue and can never be fully disentangled from an interpretation of present historical circumstances. Brackets White, 2000, 10 to 11. Not all postmodern theorists then purport to be post-metaphysical, just as some who purport to be post-metaphysical, such as Rawls and Habermas, and those inspired by them, are not postmodern theorists. See chapters 7 and 12. Nice is often the inspiration behind the onto stories affirmed within postmodern theory. in terms of both content and style. He offers a vision of the way of the world is, but he also insists that, like all metaphysical orientations, it is a conjecture he is not able to prove. Do you know what the world is to me? A monster of energy that does not expel itself but only transforms itself. A play of forces and a wave of forces, and at the same time one and many. A sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, with an ebb and a flood of its forms. Out of the simplest forms, striving toward the most complex, out of the stillest, most rigid, coldest forms, towards the hottest, most turbulent, and then again returning home to the simple out of this abundance, out of their play of contradictions, back to the joy of concord. By Nietzsche, 1987, colon 167, 1067. The delusion story of a world of protean forces shares Nietzsche's emphasis on an open-ended dynamism and flow, as does Lyotard's A Positive Postmodern Fable, a sci-fi tale of humans preparing to escape the Earth as the sun is about to burn out. Also, like Nietzsche, Lyotard describes a world without the promise of a final eschatological achievement. If to be modern, says Lyotard, is to long to re-establish a full and whole relation with the law of the other as is was in the beginning. Then to be postmodern is to try to cure thought and action in this eschatological desiring. Lyotard discerns this desire not only in Christian political theory but in some Enlightenment narratives, in romanticist and speculative dialectics, and in Marxism. He is particularly harsh on what he takes to be Habermas's search for universal consensus, a search Lyotard identifies with their terroristic conformity. Brackets Docker 1994. The Kenyan political theory, whose relationship to postmodernism is in other ways more complicated, also rejects the desire for fullness discernible in much of political theory. It seeks a democratic polity based not on the vision of a harmonious social whole, but upon the recognition of the impossibility and the catastrophic consequences of such a dream. In more general terms, postmodern theory that does not seek to be post metaphysical pursues a metaphysics of immanence, an onto-story where there is nothing outside of the immensely complex, wondrously diverse, and never fully manifest material world. In the two world metaphysics of Plato, Augustine, and Kant, immanence is conceived as immanent to something transcendent that is given moral or conceptual primacy. The goal of the postmodern metaphysicians, in contrast, is to think immanence without reintroducing transcendence, and to narrate what Giorgio Agamben calls the vertigo in which outside and inside, immanence and transcendence are absolutely indistinguishable. The outside is pictured as an evanescent field brackets of difference, the virtual, etc. That is nevertheless not transcendent because it is always already folding into immanent realm of discrete entities. It is the constitutive outside. There is a materialist energetics in several versions of postmodern, not the mechanical materialism of classical metaphysics, but an immanent materialism in which the world itself contains the power to metamorphose at unexpected junctures from old forms into new and surprising ones. Deleuze and Guattari speak, for example, of nature as a perpetual machine and for generating new and dynamic compositions. Nature as a pure plane of immanence upon which everything is given, upon which uniform elements and materials dance. This onto story shares Hegel's sense of nature as a fluid field of potentialities, but not Hegel's confidence about the possibility of taming this force or this lack of concern about the violence involved in doing so. For Hegel, the encounter with nature's becoming provokes the desire to be to quoting Hegel to compel this Proteus to seize its transformations and to show itself to us and declare itself to us so that it may not present us with a variety of ever new forms, but in simpler fashion bring to our consciousness in language what it is. Brackets 1974 colon 199. Postmodern theory affirms Hegel's insights into the protean character of life, but aspires to a different balance between being and becoming in social life. Subheading: Humans, Animals, and Cyborgs. Postmodern theorizing repositions the human in relation to the non human entities and forces with which it shares the world. Its metaphysics of immanence displaces humans from the center of the universe. We are viewed instead as a particularly complex and reflexive formation, differing from other forms in significant degree but not in kind. Humankind is taken for a complex material system, consciousness for an effect of language, and language for a highly complex material system. Bra- uh, Apostrophe close brackets Lyotard 1997 colon 98. Human beings are more complex animals rather than animals with apostrophe with an extra added ingredient called intellect, or that the rational soul apostrophe close. The thought and thinking are not devalued here. They are made part of the natural world in which we are set. The suspicion amongst opponents of postmodern approaches to political theory is that if one denies a two world metaphysics, one necessarily disparages the importance of thinking. But a variety of postmodern thinkers believe that to give thinking its due of a sophisticated process and creative activity, it is important to address its implication in somatic forces and natural systems. The human is pictured as a mixture of categories of things against which it is traditionally been defined. We are hybrids of animal and machine, culture and biology, language and effect. We are cyborgs, says Donna Haraway, 1989, who examines the advantages and disadvantages of this for democratic politics, feminism, and multicultural coexistence. Bruno Latour says that the human is not one pole to be opposed to another, called the non human, but rather a weaver of morphisms. The expression of anthropomorphic considerably underestimates our humanity. We should all be talking about technomorphisms, zoomorphisms, physiomorphisms, idiomorphisms, theomorphisms, sociomorphisms, psychomorphisms. Their alliances and their exchanges taken together are what define the anthropos. Brackets 1993 colon 937. Deleuze and Guattari's 1987 discussion of the childhood game of becoming animal explores the positive potential of this mobile hybridity. The game, they say, reveals the child's sense of herself as born from an over-rich field of protein forces and materials, not only some of which are tapped by her current human form. In playing their barking, mooing, chirping, growling games, children bear witness to an inhuman contrivance with the animal within them. Quoting, quote, it is as though independent of the evolution carrying them towards adulthood, they were born, they were room in the child for other becomings, other contemporaneous possibilities. They are not regressions but creative involutions, bearing witness to an inhumanity immediately experienced in the body as much. Brackets 1987 colon 273. The postmodern emphasis on the shared material basis of all things, of humans, animals, artifacts, and natural objects, also advances an ecological sense of interconnectedness. In its environmentalism, postmodernism competes with other theoretical approaches as a route to a more progressive politics. See further chapter 14. Subheading: The Physics of Becoming. Postmodern theorists picture the human being, like everything else that is, to be engaged in ongoing transitions between being and becoming. For Derrida, becoming is what makes possible any progress or improvement towards an ideal political life. Quoting Derrida, if man is a perfectible creature, that is, if the identity of man is something to come, then the limits of humanity are not given. So, from that point of view, to be suspicious about the limits of man is not to be anti humanist. On the contrary, it is a way of respecting what remains to come under the name and the face of what we call man. Brackets 2001 colon 44. Individuals and states are not, however, fully in charge of this process or best understood as the master agents behind it. Again, humanity is one wondrous material manifestation among the others. It has good, though inadequate, resources for intervening in life and inflecting the direction of becoming. The stuff of becoming is conceived as energy, force, affect, intensity, or life. These flows both subsist within intentions, spirituality, morality, culture, identity, and reasoning, and help to give them the potential for mobility. None of these traditional entities is denied, but all are taken to be second order formations emerging out of what of that which they are not. Within such an onto story, it would be foolish to attempt to master the world. Becomings can be facilitated, shifted, or resisted, but not commanded or ordered completely. Lyotard's 1997 postmodern fable dramatizes this point, and its energy is engaged in a perpetual and productive struggle between entropic disorder and the development of increasingly complex systems of order. This development, quoting Lyotard, is not an invention made by humans. Humans are an invention of development. The hero of the fable is not the human species but energy. The fable narrates a series of episodes marking now the success of what is most likely, death, and now the success of what is least likely and most precarious, and what is also the most efficient, the complex. Brackets 1997 92. At the end of the fable, some being is seeking to escape the earth, but whether it is a human and is her brain, and or a brain and its human, that the story does not tell. Postmodern theory experiments with the idea that society and nature participate in similar logics, the non-linear ordering of a web of interdependencies. Here, cultural theorists have sought to adjust complexity theory, originally developed by scientists to describe the most perplexing physical systems, to describe political and social relations. Lyotard brackets 1997, Deleuze and Guattari 1987, and Michel Serres 1982, for example, draw upon the work of the Nobel laureate in chemistry Ilya Prigogine. Their postmodern theories do not reject modern science, as some critics contend, but actively endorse one version of modern science, the one that understands nature in terms of turbulent systems where small changes in background conditions can have big effects, where micro shifts can produce macro effects. Prigogine articulates a version of natural science congenial to postmodern cultural theory. He and his collaborator, the philosopher of science Isabel Stengers, eschew the model of nature implied in classical dynamics, which presents a silent world, a dead, passive nature, a nature that behaves as an automaton, which, once programmed, continues to follow the rules inscribed in the program. Their own model engages a nature where creativity and novelty abound and where the possible is richer than the real. They insist, however, that nature retains a kind of intelligibility even in its most complex and indeterminate states. Nature is neither the static world of classical dynamics nor some random set of fluctuations, unrecognizable as a world. A new formulation of the laws of nature is now possible, in which there is room for both laws of nature and novelty and creativity. Postmodern theory tends, in its various manifestations, to conceive the relationship between social order and change in a similar manner, as an incompletely structured system, an open system susceptible to unpredictable encounters and the periodic emergence of new formations. Subheading: Reason and Effect. Postmodern approaches to political theory do not reject reasoning, rationality, or enlightenment values. They do call it into question. Reason, that is, the Kantian idea of a transcendental field that finds various expressions in the scientific, moral, and aesthetic judgments of human beings. Foucault, for example, believes that the central issue of philosophy and critical thought since the 18th century has been, still is, and will, I hope, remain the question. What is the reason that we use? What are its historical effects? What are its limits? And what are its dangers? Brackets 1989, 267. To employ reasoning without recourse to reason, as postmodern theory does, it is to develop a heightened sensitivity to the ethical and political dangers of relying upon reasoning out of its relationship to less cognitive forms of knowing and experiencing. There is a distinctive set of fears and anxieties that provoke postmodern thinking, including the excessive regulation and normalization of persons, places, and experiences. One of the negative effects of societal rationalization and scientific categorization is the marginalization and denigration of people found not to measure up to prevailing criteria of rationality, normality, and responsibility. White 1998. This element of cruelty within rationality is said to coexist alongside its nobler achievements. Second, liability. of rationality concerns its inadequacy as a somatic inspiration for ethical action. Rational principles do not provide their own incentive for enactment. The key claim here is that ethics requires both reasoning and effect. Affect, where reasoning refers to acts of representation and systematic thought, and effects here refers to feelings imbued thoughts and that are not representational. Though affect is in ordinary parlance used as a synonym for emotion, in postmodern theory it is associated with a more protean kind of force, an intensity not yet organized into the distinct shape of emotion. Masumi, 2002. On this model of ethics, ethics entails both a moral code, which condenses moral ideals and metaphysical assumptions into rational principles and reasonable rules, and an embodied sensibility, which organizes affects into a style and generates the impetus to enact the code. Moral codes, for example, the Ten Commandments, remain inert without a disposition hospitable to their injunctions, the perceptual refinement necessary to apply them to particular cases, and the effective energy needed to perform them. Foucault puts the point this way: for an action to be moral, it must not be reducible to an act or a series of acts conforming to a rule, a law, or a value. There is no moral conduct that does not also call for the forming of oneself as an ethical subject, and no forming of the ethical subject without practices of the self that support them. Bracket 1985 28. Regardless of whether the ethical code is conceived as divine command or pragmatic rule, if the code is to be transferred into acts, affects must be engaged, orchestrated, and bound to it. Here, postmodern theory adopts and inflects an insight from the romanticism. Its emphasis on the importance of rituals, exercises, drills, and litanies is one example of how postmodern theory attends to the affective and aesthetic dimensions of political and ethical life and thought. In so doing, postmodern theory also connects to religious traditions, micropolitics, and macropolitics. Postmodern theorizing draws attention to the socially transformative potential of micropolitical practices. It insists upon the connection between micropolitics and macropolitics. Deleuze and Guattari use the term micropolitics to name a realm of activities that have public effect, that help to shape the tenor of collective life, but which do not fill into the traditional paradigms of political action. Micropolitical activities are not official acts of presidents or parliaments, and they are often not aimed directly at elections or legislative agendas. Rather, the key agencies of micropolitics are television shows, films, military training, professional meetings, worship services, clubs, neighborhood gangs, and internet mobilizations. And its key targets are bodily affect, social tempers, political moods, and cultural sensibilities. The emphasis upon micropolitics issues from the belief that there is an indispensably somatic and affective dimension to political and all other human action, including macropolitical action. Partly a response to Marxist criticisms, the notion of micropolitics is a more intersubjective and collectivist version of Foucault's notion of technologies or practices of the self, which he defined as the means through which humans effect a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts, conducts, and ways of being, so as to transform themselves. Brackets 1988:18. Micropolitics aims to reform, refine, intensify, or discipline the emotions, aesthetic impulses, moral and moralistic urges, and diffuse moods that enter into brackets and make possible political programs, party affiliations, ideological commitments, and policy preferences. Why do postmodern theorists advocate working experimentally upon such affections? Because to do so is ultimately, though indirectly and unpredictably, to alter the micro settings in which we participate and to help determine the macro political possibilities. Moods and effects are also said to be relevant to public life in that they may provide the motivational energy required to enact intellectual commitments or political priorities, to transform them into actualities. Page 52. Again, the idea is to give the affective dimension of thought and action its due. Politics, in the broadest sense, as action that makes a public difference, requires not only intellectual things, brackets like principles, programs of reform visions of the future, bracket close, but also embodied sensibility that organize affects into a style and generate the impetus to enact principles, programs, and visions. Individualistic iconoclasts and queer theories employ micropolitics in order to render themselves resistant to the lure of conformity and the demand for normality. Transcendentalists, in the tradition of Henry Thoreau, engage in a series of practical exercises, including nature walks, perceptual attentiveness to small details of ordinary things, journal writing, in order to foster a more deliberate life. Eco spiritualists advocate meditation, and wilderness excursions as ways of enhancing the experience of the interdependency of all things. Religious activists engage in prayer or church attendance as ways of disciplining the body and developing good character. Deleuze and Guattari use micropolitical techniques to experiment with becoming otherwise and to forestall the reduction of becoming to being. Postmodern political theory acknowledges that micropolitics can be pursued on behalf of different aims and as a wide variety of political ideologies. Subheading: Disciplinary Power and the Possibility of Freedom. One influential postmodern insight is that the power exercised over citizens and subjects does not only issue from identifiable loci like the state and its laws. It also operates more diffusely and more insidiously by means of moral everyday practices which have no particular author and instead present themselves as simply the way of things are done. Foucault describes the first as a juridical model of power and the second as disciplinary, normalizing, or biopower. His early genealogies of criminality, madness, and sexuality sensitized readers to the medical, educational, and military, and even architectural practices that function to inscribe norms right onto the body. Terry Eagleton describes this second kind of power, which operates primarily not by means of prohibition but rather by constituting the very subjectivity of its objects, when he warns that the romantic attempt to conjoin reason with sentiment had the effect of inscribing power in the minutiae of subjective experience. Thus, it participated in the larger historical trend whereby power is shifting its location from centralized institutions to the silent, invisible depths of the subject itself. But this focus on the pervasiveness of power does not mean that there is no such thing, from a postmodern perspective, as freedom. In his later work, Foucault, for example, affirmed a project of aesthetic self-inscription and suggested that sensibility was susceptible, to some degree, to self-conscious craftsmanship. This craftsmanship is not reducible to those reflexive arcs by which one uses new thoughts to revise old beliefs, though that is part of it. It also folds specific postures, sounds, and images into what processes so as to impinge more actively upon the affective register of being. And the point of Foucault's early genealogies is to expose the normal individual as a ruse of power, as a ruse and to disrupt our association of self discipline with freedom. The point of his later work is to enunciate the more complex thesis that there is no self without power and discipline, and no power or discipline that does not harbor opportunities for freedom in terms of the arts of the self. What kind of freedom can coexist with ubiquitous productive power? A postmodern notion of freedom is not the Kantian idea of an autonomous rational will. Neither is it the romantic vision of Kant, wherein an aesthetic modulation of the psyche allows the rational will to kick in. Freedom is res- re-signified by locating it in a relationship with historically situated rationality and human embodiment. The goal is to find ways to promote a higher degree of self direction in and against a system of disciplinary power. Freedom is not defined as something that rises above desire, sensibility, and feeling. It consists rather in a reflective and often agnostic kind of heteronormity. Nominy. It is a recognition of one's implications in a sticky web of social and physical relations within which also reside vital, although unpredictable and contested, opportunities for self direction. What counts as self direction depends upon the particularities of what one has become and the sort of obstacles and opportunities culturally available. Sometimes self direction is direct by self command or self exertion, and more often it is pursued through arts, techniques, and strategies applied by the self to corporeal sensibility below the level of direct intellectual control. The experience of freedom is vibrant. One experiences the exhilaration by making a mark upon what one comes to be. But this sense of liberation does not carry one above the world of sensibility or power. It consists rather in tentative explorations of the outer edges of existing regimes of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. For postmodern political theorists, these engagements with the frontier reveal the possibility of new configurations of identity. These new configurations are still a function of an institutional matrix. They are still implicated in historically contingent practices of power, and they continue to contend with a body that never fully coincides with the subjectivity available to it. Page 53. The Ape in Kafka's Story, a report to an academy, 1971, makes a similar point. Caught and caged for exhibition, Rod Peter decided to become human, for only then he would be let out. Freedom, he says, was not what I wanted. Only a way out, right or left, or in any direction. I made no other demand. 1971, colon 53, 253 to 4. The ape man seeks not unconditional freedom, only a way to transform his situation into a place with more room to exercise his potential for self direction. Kafka here articulates a postmodern conception of freedom. Postmodern political theorizing typically concedes, then, on the assumption that moments of critical freedom are internal to a system of power. Power, quote, pervades the very conceptual apparatus that seeks to negotiate its terms, including the subject position of the critic, and this implication of terms of criticism in the field of power is not the advent of a nihilistic relativism incapable of furnishing norms, but rather the very precondition of a politically engaged critique. Butler, 1995, 38 to 39. Also Spivak, 1999. Subheading: Rhizomatic structures and lines of flight. In the onto story of a world becoming, things are moving at different speeds and metamorphoses abound. Matter is mobile, and thus so are humans and their cultural forms. Communitarian in political theory tends to view this as a lamentable and dangerous characterization of social life. It undermines the legitimacy of traditional moral codes and dims the prospect of achieving consensus on a basic set of norms and values. The fear is that the postmodern story worsens the postmodern condition, characterized as a state of fragmentation plagued by the crisis of meaning. Some postmodern theorists themselves embrace this diagnosis, but others view it as overstated by virtue of the contrast model of harmony it implicitly invokes. The contemporary world will surely appear as fragmented, and in crisis if it is compared to a lost golden age of social coherence, unquestioned morality, and pervasive faith in a single transcendent God. To question the historical plausibility of this tale of community and cosmological coherence, however, is to see things differently. Postmodern theorists find the nostalgic meta-narrative to be inappropriate, even as a regulative ideal, in a world where multicultural societies are the norm, where technological developments increase the speed with which social transformation occurs, and where peoples with diverse onto stories coexist on the same territory and under the same government. William Connolly does not, for example, support a word of fragmentation as opposed to unity, but advocates a kind of pluralism where social groups with divergent moral traditions and competing ontological convictions form pragmatic partial alliances. Attentive to the constitutive tension between the need for order, the value for disruption, reformation, he moves pluralism away from the image of a cultural center surrounded by minorities at the margin and toward a vision of public life as populated by multiple minorities with cross cutting allegiances along lines of religion, linguistic habit, economic interest, irreligion, ethnicity, sensuality, gender performances, and moral sources of inspiration. Connelly 1999 92. He calls the relations between and within these minorities rhizomatic rather than fragmenting. A rhizome is a biotechnical term for a particular kind of root structure, a non-linear and web-like organization, like that of bulbs, tubers, stems, and filaments. In contrast to a single taproot, a rhizomatic politics does not have as its regulative ideal a general consensus. It is inspired, rather, by the vision of mobile constellations whose members support mobile common policies but not necessarily all the same reasons, and who attempt to render themselves more open to responsive engagement with alternative faiths and sensualities, gender practices, ethnicities, and so on. Brackets 1999 colon 146. Practicing a generous ethos of engagement, citizens would strive to acknowledge the contestability of any moral source or onto story, including their own. Connolly, 1995. Critical theorists, like communitarians, are often wary of postmodern theory and the postmodern condition insofar as the former aggravates the latter, and both allow global capital and commodified culture to fill the void left by stable local ways of life. Postmodern theorists themselves are divided on this issue. Some emphasize the dangers of a world of becoming, example, the continual emergence of tensions between a shifting array of social groups, the endless need to renegotiate meanings, and the tendency of power relations to congenial into hegemonic, that is, capitalist formations. Others emphasize the liberating potential and marvels of this evolving world. Often the debate exists within theorists as well as between them. The question is to what extent the world of diverse shortcomings meets its match in a culture where the life world has been colonized by homogenizing commodity culture. A good example here is Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's Empire 2000, which attempts to combine Marxist insights about the structural impediments to social justice with those of Deleuze and Guattari about the potential lines of flight within every structure, that is, the omnipresence of paths along which things change or become transferred into something else. Patton, 2000 86. Page number 54. Hart, Negri, Hart and Negri transformed the old notion of the proletariat, defined in terms of industrial wage work, into the more protean and multi-class force called the multitude. Likewise, the logic of capitalism becomes something more flexible and impersonal, and thus both more diabolical and less competent. It is replaced by empire. The multitude is the real productive force of our social work, whereas empire is a mere apparatus of capture that lives only of the vitality of the multitude. Hart and Negri 2000 62. But intellectual, aesthetic, and communicative laborers cannot be completely subjugated to the laws of capitalist accumulation. At every moment, they overflow and shatter the bounds of measure. 2000 396 to 7 semicolon. See also Shapiro, 2000. Some postmodern theory discerns a limited but real potential for justice and freedom within market and commodity centered economies. It is unlikely to view capitalism as a as closed system with no way out short of revolutionary violence. It tentatively affirms the ambivalent excitement about capitalism transformative possibilities expressed by Marx himself. Robbins 1999 35. This postmodernism does not necessarily advocate a post-market economy and rejects the image of global capital as a monster devouring everything in its path as both empirically and inaccurate and politically disabling. Quote, the impossibility of a global order must be affirmed. If we can accept that it is impossible to subsume every individual being, place, and practice to a universal law, then it will follow that the local cannot be fully interior to the global, nor can its inventive potential be captured by any singular imagining of the economy. Gibson, Graham, 2003. Such work aims to deny capitalism quite the degree of efficacy and totalizing power than its critics and defenders often attribute to it, and to exploit the positive ethical potential secreted within it. Bennett, again, such analysis work with particular image of power, in which there is always something that flows or flees that escapes the overcoding machine. Deleuze and Guattari, 1987, 216. Though capitalists may be the master of surplus value and its distribution, they do not dominate the flows from which surplus value derives. 1987 226. The notion of lines of flight that persist within the densest of networks of power, or of the subsistence of a virtual world within the actual, or of the possibility of forging rhizomatic connections between people who do not share a common moral framework, reveals a link between postmodern theory and the political hopefulness of the cultural revolution of the 1960s. Postmodern theory affirms the value of idealizations, even if they are ideals, regulative ideals not fully realizable. Roman Coles, for example, defends a post secular non theistic ethic of generosity, even though its practice must always fall short of the highest solicitation to give. Brackets 1997 81. Foucault suggests that political freedom is enabled by the impossible desire of self direction and the dream of a beautifully designed subjectivity. Derrida has faith in a justice that is a kind of reserve which is not exhausted by any particular concept of justice. Quote, on one hand, you have the law, which is deconstructible. That is, the set of legislations which are deconstructible because we can change them, we improve them, we want to improve them, we can improve them. On the other hand, justice, in the name of which one deconstructs the law, is not deconstructible. Bracket 2001 6, 9. Like all approaches to political theory, postmodernism has developed a distinctive vocabulary, but perhaps more than other approaches, it has refused to translate its insights directly into an idiom compatible with the traditional cognitive machinery of political thought. Brackets White, 1981, 19. New modes of political organization seem to acquire new ways of thinking. The experience of alienation that accompanies the encounter with a foreign language can have positive political effects if there is a vision of politics common to postmodern theories. It is of a political realm that renegotiates the age old debate between being and becoming in order to give more room to becoming and to render itself more open to change and democratic in operation. Thank you.